All righty, everybody. Hi, this is Deborah Bettolotti, Compliance Chat today for Maximum One Executive Realtors. I am going to go ahead and get started. Today's conversation has to do with procuring cause. Who here can tell me what they believe procuring cause is? Anybody? Raise your virtual hand if so, or put it in chat. Nobody. All right, well, we're going to go ahead and talk about procuring cause regardless. So if anybody does want to go ahead and share, feel free to raise your virtual hand or your real hand, but preferably your virtual hand. All right. Today, for those of you that don't know me, I do see a few new people. My name is Deborah Bettolotti. I am the compliance broker at Maximum One Executive Realtors. I've been licensed since 1994, and I have 9 grandbaby boys. So that is my why. So those are my baby boys right there. Some of them anyway. With that being said, let's go ahead and talk about what we're talking about today, which is procuring cause. I want everyone to go ahead and put in chat what they believe the words procuring cause mean. Go ahead and put it in chat. And hi, Mary. Hi, Cheryl. Like I said, feel free to put your cameras on. Love to see your beautiful faces. Let's see. I don't see anything coming on chat. Let's see. Put it in chat. What do y'all think procuring cause means? All right. You were the one that connected the buyer and seller together, says Myrna. And that is actually the most common answer I receive when I ask this question. So thank you for stating that. But I'm going to, somebody says successful transaction. Well, let's go ahead and delve into this a little further so we can talk about it. So procuring cause does mean possibly that you were connected to that person, the buyer and seller together, but it's not necessarily going to be the procuring cause. For those of you that may have recently taken pre-licensing or post-licensing, or if you real quickly back into that time of pre-license, we can discuss what that is. Jackie says, is you're the person that got the offer written up. Actually, that doesn't even mean procuring cause. So procuring cause, as per for the test, is an uninterrupted chain of events. Uninterrupted chain of events. So just getting the client or just writing the offer or a successful transaction, those can all be parts of that chain of events, but it is not going to give you the right to procuring cause. So it's very important that we speak about it. I chose to speak about it because it seemed to be like the theme of the week, or theme of the month, really. And it just seemed like that question was being asked over and over. Hey, I'm owed a commission. You may be or you may not be. So let's talk about it, because procuring cause is actually a concept in real estate that will determine who gets the entitlement to that compensation, right? When it is sold. And it refers to that uninterrupted chain of action that directly led to the successful sale or purchase of that property. So in other words, it's not necessarily who showed the property. It's not necessarily who wrote the offer, and it never has been. The definition has been the same since real estate was conceived, but for some reason, we all kind of interpreted it as we chose to interpret it. So the one who initiated or facilitated the sale and then dropped it, that would not be a procuring cause. Now, if they facilitated the sale, they began the sale, they're the ones that gave you the information about the lender, they're the ones that gave you the information about everything in the neighborhood, they're the ones that wrote the offer, and then they were the ones at closing, that would be procuring cause. That is a chain of events. But it's not always that straightforward, is it? And it can involve various factors. So it can involve everything from the initial contact with the client And then as well as the ongoing communication and support that you offer that client. And then, of course, once the client decides to make a purchase offer or close on the property. So it is, if it was to go to arbitration, it would be basically determined based on all those pictures and all the circumstances, not just one. There's actually a worksheet that NAR would use if it went to arbitration that talks about I want to say about 6 or 7 questions that involve whether it is procuring cause. And that involves communication, that involves your actions, as well as documentation. So let's keep delving into this. But before I move on, has anyone ever been in either the receiving or the other end of procuring cause where you felt like you were owed a commission and didn't get it, or you were on the other end where you ended up doing the transaction and somebody else said they were owed a commission? Anybody? Nobody? Well, that's good. Glad to hear nobody has been, but
No, I have years ago, but I can't remember the specifics of it. I
okay.
just, I didn't get it.
Gotcha,
I remember
gotcha.
that.
You didn't get it. Okay. Yeah, that's always not fun, right? Well, why does
I have
oh, who said that?
Jackie.
Okay, Jackie, talk to us.
I did an open house
Uh-huh.
and one of the, you know, buyers coming in signed and, signed in, and then later on went behind and went directly to the buyer. And
Ooh.
they tried to do the sale. At the time, I was working with Remax. They were able to contact, get in touch with the title company, send paperwork. They put a lien on the house, and then I got my commission.
Wow, so you really went through it.
Yeah.
Did you have to go through arbitration?
Yes. And they agreed to, they agreed I had my sign-in sheet. They didn't really fight it.
Okay. That's
Mhm.
awesome. Now, you were pretty much honestly lucky, in my opinion, that it went through that and that you still won, because that is actually one of the examples I like to use. Having a sign-in sheet at an open house is not sufficient to create a procuring cause as per NAR.
Mhm.
So you were actually pretty lucky on that end, because you would have to have had, again, more than that, especially if you were representing the seller on that one. So I'm glad that happened for you,
Mhm.
but that is not technically the normality of it. So
Okay.
the reality is that they probably said, we just don't want to go forward with it. And now, you're sure you went through arbitration, or they just made an agreement prior to arbitration?
I'm assuming we did because.
Oh, you would know if you went through arbitration.
Oh, okay then. Because we had to talk. We had to meet with somebody.
Uh-huh.
I had to show my sign-in sheet, and I had spoke to those the sellers themselves. Like, we were in contact too.
Gotcha. Was it your
And
listing?
it was my listing, and the seller had called. Excuse me, the buyer had called and wanted to view the house, do everything, and I happened to, like, they might have called, like, say on a Friday, and I was doing the open house on Saturday. So they had called me, they came in, we were in contact, we were talking. I had their lender information, like I had all their information.
Right.
At some point, they just stopped contacting me.
Ooh, so let me ask you this. How long ago was that?
Ooh, like 8 years ago.
Okay. The reason I'm asking is because if your seller was your client
Mm-hmm.
and the buyer was a customer, then the minute you started talking about the lender situation and all that, you could have
Mm-hmm.
possibly gone into a dual agent situation. So I could see where the buyer would have actually been winning. So you got real lucky.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Well, they put an offer in, so I needed them. Like, I needed their pre-qual letter. Like, they were,
but you didn't recommend the lender.
No. They were
Gotcha.
sending their information to put an offer in.
Gotcha.
And
Okay.
do all that, right?
Very interesting. Okay, well, I'm glad that worked out for you. And as you can see, I think Jackie just answered my question as to why it matters, right?
Hmm.
Procuring cause matters because if you are truly the procuring cause or found to be the procuring cause in an arbitration situation, then you're entitled to that compensation. So with that, it definitely is important to have the documentation, and that documentation in Jackie's place or situation was that open house sign-in.
Good morning.
Good morning. And the determination of the procuring cause is what is going to create the compensation entitlement. So the main thing that arbitrators are looking at, if it ever goes into a procuring cause situation, is that successful completion of the transaction and making sure that the agent made significant contributions to the sale. So in Jackie's example, for example, she had she had been the one that showed him. She apparently had spoken with them. So she had all the records of having seen that. We do have to be cautious if we are in a customer client situation where it's not as simple, because a customer, as per BREDA and as per agency law, is entitled to go find their own agent for representation. But that doesn't alleviate the compensation part. So, I wasn't going to use something as complicated as Jackie's scenario, but that was perfect since it was real, where she did do the contribution. In theory, if I was talking about agency today, which I'll use that as a teachable moment regarding agency, she could have said, hey, you're entitled to have your own agent write the offer. But if she went ahead, or the buyer went ahead and said, no, go ahead, I want to talk to you, and then she shows them the house, she contributes to the transaction, and then they still go to another agent, then because she did have significant contribution to the sale, that could be enough to be owed a compensation, and the buyer would have to then pay their agent separately. So that's where it gets a little more complicated. But ensuring that you are the one entitled to that compensation is not that simple. So truly, if you're in a position where you think you might be entitled to a compensation, and you think and believe that you were that procuring cause, then you should let the transaction close first and then go forward with it, because we need to move forward and figure out what's going on. It's not as simple to figure out in advance. But we're going to talk more about documentation and the steps to make sure that you are the one compensated if needed. Now, nobody's mentioned a buyer brokerage agreement. Is a buyer brokerage agreement enough to be procuring costs? What do y'all think?
No.
No, but it is a contractual obligation. So then we go into a different situation, which is why that buyer brokerage is so important. And back when we first started talking about procuring cause 30, 40, 50 years ago, right? We didn't have the buyer agency like we do now. So it gets a little more muddied waters when we start talking about it. But if Myrna, for example, has a buyer agency signed with Fran, and then Jackie goes ahead and writes the offer for Fran, and she showed Fran, she asked Fran if she was working with an agent and all of that, and she goes and writes an offer, and Myrna sees that it closed and then calls Jackie and says, you owe me a commission. And Fran never signed anything with Jackie, only with Myrna. Would then Myrna be entitled to a commission, even though she didn't show her the house? What do y'all think?
Who does she have the agreement signed with?
She has it signed with Myrna, but you wrote the offer and closed on the contract with her.
No, they don't owe Myrna nothing.
They actually would.
They would?
They absolutely would. And more importantly, it probably would have come from you instead of the buyer. in that
Okay.
situation, because it would be your duty to have that, to get that information found out. Now, if, for instance, and I'll be right with you, Tammy, if, for instance, you, Jackie, had gotten another buyer brokerage signed and the buyer had quote unquote lied to you, that would be a different story.
Gotcha. Okay.
Tammy, you had a question.
Yeah. Hey, Deborah. So I am not very familiar with this, and I know it's not new, the Shawami situation.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so can you, with what you're talking about, this is very interesting to me that agents are, maybe 4 hours from the subject property to show it to a buyer, and you can't get to Savannah, and you're calling this Shawami thing to ask them. How does that play in?
Oh, thank you for asking that, Tammy. That is a great point. Well, if they're doing it the truthful way, which is truly just opening the door and showing the house and explaining only what's on the MLS, then you're just paying for a showing service. It doesn't have anything to do with the procuring cause part of it.
So do you have an agreement with said Shawami person to open said house prior to, almost like a co-op commission agreement? So you would have something in play with this person who legally can access a lockbox or can enter a property. I mean, I've heard some horror stories, so I've never used it. I was just kind of curious for my
Yeah.
own information.
Well, it would be no different than if I said to you, Tammy, hey, do you mind opening that door down the street from you? I just need you to open the door. So I could then pay your broker, and that's where it gets a little tricky too.
Yeah,
You're supposed to
yeah.
have permission from your broker to pay you directly, but it would, in theory, be a showing service, almost like an admin showing or admin service. So, but it still wouldn't have anything to do with whether you're procuring cause or not.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, so you could show 20 houses and it wouldn't matter. A Shawami could show 20 houses, but you could still technically not be entitled to a compensation.
Right.
But when you register with Shawami, in doing that application, that's what you're agreeing to, just showing the house
Correct.
prior to them, using you.
Correct. Yeah, it's simply a showing service. It
Service,
has nothing to do with representation. So I'm not crazy about them because I feel like you're losing that personal touch, and I wouldn't want to show anybody without a buyer brokerage agreement. Regardless, even using Shawami, you still want to have that buyer brokerage agreement signed with your buyer prior to calling Shawami.
And I've also heard, Deborah, that what happens, is that you get this service, the buyer meets them, they like them, and then they don't want to come back to you.
Wow, I have not heard that per se, because again, in theory, they're supposed to only open the door and say what's in the MLS.
Gotcha.
So if they actually like them, there's probably been a relationship begun, you know what I mean? But yeah, you run that risk with anybody. Even if I called you and said, hey, open the door down the street, it could be that that buyer prefers you to me. So I always run that risk. So that's where that buyer brokerage agreement is so important.
But you also just made a good point, and thank you for saying that, and we have to remember that as brokers, especially when you have this agreement, you need the permission of your broker to accept that money straight away and not go through the brokerage firm. So thank you for relaying that again.
Yes. So like if Shawami, like I know some of the companies, some of the offices in our franchise do have that agreement. And that's okay because it's a written agreement already stated in there. So that's already kind of a blanket approval. But if you don't have that blanket approval, yes, you are not to be paying anybody directly. Absolutely. Well, with that being said, yeah, the commission directly impacts, the compensation, and I should have written compensation because we have to remember to stop using the word commission, guys. So the compensation.
The address of where you're headed. It sent me.
The compensation, the determination of procuring cause will definitely impact who that compensation goes to. And usually you can't really figure that out until after that transaction has closed. Additionally, when it comes to agents, protecting agents, kind of like to the point of what Tammy just mentioned too, we want to protect each other, guys. We want to have a level of protection. I was speaking with somebody the other day about the fact that, we did have the misconception that procuring cause was simply who showed the property. That's a misconception we've had for years. But the reason we had that, in my opinion, would have to do with also back in the day, and I'm dating myself by saying this, but we really had personal relationships in person. We would do everything in person. We didn't do Zoom. We didn't do the phone calls. So we had a level of relationship that if somebody told me they were working with somebody else, I would be more appreciative, I think, than even today, where I was like, oh, you've already spent, Sada's time. You need to call Sada back. And we had a level of camaraderie and collaboration that I see somewhat, and I don't want to say it's missing. I don't want to say people are unethical by any means, because I would never do that. But my point, I see others' faces saying it, but my point being that we have to protect each other, guys. We're all in this together. I've often shared that when my husband and I would go out of town, we would leave our business in another agent's hands. I never felt threatened. I never felt like I would come back and worry as to that agent stealing my business. And she would take care of the business. We would give her a referral for any new buyers or deals she did during that time. And then we would do the same for her when she went out of town. We had a level of camaraderie. I would love to see that coming back. And procuring cause is somewhat of a protection for that, because it establishes the clear guidelines for which compensation is the entitlement of it. So it does also help prevent the disputes and the conflicts between the agents, because it's clearly defined as to what that procuring cause is. And yet we're all confused by it all the time. But it's due to the documentation, and it's supported by whatever evidence we have, which is why having documentation is huge. And the representation is something that we briefly spoke about with that buyer brokerage agreement. And you guys hear me hounding you guys about it all the time. But it's very, very, very important to understand what representation you have and your role with that client or customer, for that matter. That representation needs to be clear, as per Georgia law, at first contact. Yet so often for the many, many years, we've been operating by, oh, let me go show you the house and then we'll talk about representation, when the law is very clear about it being at first contact. So this year, more importantly than ever, even though our law for buyer brokerage agreement has been in place, this year it's a lot more prevalent due to all the news out there. So I hope every single one of you guys are getting those buyer brokerage agreements signed before you ever step foot and show them any house. Because just saying, hey, I'm the one that showed the house isn't going to cut it. So make sure that you are being very, very, very clear about that and having those signed in advance. So pursuant to Article 17 of the Realtor Code of Ethics, for those of you that are members of a board of realtors, it says the uninterrupted series of casual events which results in a successful transaction. So that's why I said it must close first. And in practice, the broker that set off the unbroken chain of events will be regarded as the procuring cause. So that's what's super, super important to understand. It's not the successful transaction. It's not the showing of the property. It's not even the buyer brokerage agreement. So understanding that is going to be huge, because the procuring cause can have the legal implications in real estate transactions where disputes arise over the entitlement of the compensation. But the courts are going to consider the various factors, including your actions, the timing of the events, and any written agreements or communications. If you are putting notes in your CRM, that is huge, guys. It's going to help you immensely because that would be part of that documentation that you can use in order to claim entitlement to that compensation. But if you understand that and are clear on all that, you can then navigate the transaction without being concerned, right? You don't have to be afraid because there's clarity, there's confidence, and you're minimizing the risk of the disputes and the conflicts. So understand that. Oops, that wasn't meant to be there. Understand that it's extremely, extremely important to have that placed in there. I'm going to read something to you guys. Hang on one second. I'm going over here. I'm going to read this to you. Let's see. So I'm going to tell you, a buyer contacted broker Jim to show her several homes over a period of weeks. So she showed several homes. She even showed them later on to family members, and actually I'm going to stop the share for a minute. Hang on. And she was showing the house. She showed it like 15 to 20 homes. She couldn't make up her mind, right? And when she showed this home, she even went and showed it to friends and family because they wanted to make sure that that was the right home, right? And even as they were leaving the home, the buyer's dad is a plumber. And so they even went back another time. So she showed it 3 or 4 times. And then later on, a few days later, the agent that showed it, Jim, received an offer from Jane, and it was the same buyers. And Jim had been working with these buyers for a while. Who do you think deserved the compensation at that point? Jim or Jane? Jim showed like 15 to 20 homes, worked for about 3 weeks. You think so?
Whoever got the buyer broker agreement signed.
Whoever got the buyer broker agreement signed? Anybody else? And this is straight from a scenario that NAR put out there. It's a true story. So basically, and I'm going to read it verbatim, it says, if you think broker Jim is a procuring cause, you're falling into the common trap of believing it's based on that definitive factor. In this case, showing the home all those times. But who, and they didn't give us enough to really give a fair assessment, because what it says here is who did all the follow-up communication. I didn't say Jim followed up with them, right? So if he went and showed those 15 to 20 homes, but broker Jane is the one that was actually following up and giving them lender information and even comps and things like that, she's the one that wrote the offer and they get to closing, it's Jane that is entitled to that compensation. So it gets real tricky, doesn't it? So it's one of those things that the buyer brokerage, because again, NAR doesn't really go into the buyer brokerages because it's not state, now it will be nationwide, but at that time when they wrote this, it wasn't nationwide. But yes, the buyer brokerage agreement would definitely be a determining factor, as would everything else. So we have to stop thinking, in my opinion, hey, I showed all these properties, I'm entitled. It goes way beyond that, way, way, way beyond that. If you go show a buyer a property and then later on never follow up, if a buyer walks into your open house, even signs an open house register, but you don't follow up with that buyer and then you receive an offer, good luck with that procuring cause. So you've got to be careful to not fall into that. And I'm going to pull up the arbitration worksheet so you can just see it. And you can kind of see what I mean. It's definitely not clear until you speak to every single point. but it is something, and you guys can pull this up anytime you want. I'm going to show you. And let's see. So if you see here, we're going to go ahead and open this up. So you see here, this is actually an arbitration worksheet. Whoops, hang on a second. I am not showing the right one. Hang on, let me get out of here. There we go. So this is a full arbitration worksheet. This isn't just one thing. But if you go to section 6, that's where the procuring cause part starts. When was the first introduction to the property that was sold or leased? Was the introduction made when the buyer tenant had a specific need for that type of property? Was the introduction instrumental in creating the purchase? And did the buyer know about the property before the broker contacted him? Did he know it was for sale or lease? And were there previous dealings between the buyer and the seller? Those are the questions that would be absolutely looked at when it comes to procuring cause. So let me see. Natalie wrote, I am something similar right now with the seller. Oh, sorry. Okay. Yes, and we can look at it from the seller's side. I do need a little more clarification. If we're looking at it at the seller's side, are we meaning like from a situation where you're representing the seller as a listing?
Yeah, I can give you the.
Yeah, go ahead,
the
give me the whole
situation.
scenario.
So I did a listing presentation with a seller. He signed the listing agreement. I gave him the staging guidelines. He did everything that I told him to do. We were just waiting on him to book photos. Like 3 days before, I called him. I said, we're trying to schedule photos for Wednesday. And he came back and he was like, a house just sold on my street. His neighbor sold for a certain price. I said, great. I said, if you can get your home to look in equal or better condition, then we can discuss closer to the time your price. But right now, the condition of your home won't bring that value. They said, okay, I'm working on getting the home ready, so on and so forth. Then last week he went MIA. Friday I checked. I didn't see him live. Monday I come into the office. He's live with another agent. So that's where I'm at right now. So this is right on time.
Oh,
And
wow. So let me ask you this, Natalie. You stated there's a couple issues with what you stated. You stated he signed the listing agreement.
He signed my listing agreement, yeah.
So what date was that? Do you know?
It was March the 27th. He
So
signed
by
the
March the 29th, it should have been in the MLS.
He was registered in the MLS because MLS allows you to
Yeah.
register.
So you had him on registered?
Yeah, I had him on registered. He was supposed to go live April 10th. He changed it to say photos with, so I've already gone through.
Yeah. So how did MLS allow it to go active?
So what FMLS told me yesterday was register does not stop another agent from being able to put it in there. We're learning this now.
That's
But
news
if
to
I
me,
had
too.
it as coming soon,